Every parent knows that moment when their child brings home a stray animal, eyes full of hope and heart set on keeping it. When 8-year-old Grace found a scraggly golden retriever by the roadside near her grandparents' old farm, her family smiled and shook their heads. Here she goes again with another wild idea. The dog had no collar and matted fur, but Grace insisted he was trying to show her something important in the overgrown woods. Her aunts and uncle chuckled at her imagination, but Grace followed the dog anyway. What they found changed everything. The ruins of a forgotten mansion and clues to a $200 million inheritance that had been waiting decades to be discovered. The real treasure wasn't the money, though it was watching this discovery either tear the family apart or bring them closer than ever before. Could a child's trust in a homeless dog unlock more than just buried riches? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Grace arrived at Willowbrook Farm. The summer air carried the scent of wild honeysuckle and the distant promise of rain. Her grandmother Elma stood on the wraparound porch, silver hair catching the early light as she watched the taxi wind up the gravel drive. At 78, Eleanor still possessed the quiet dignity that had carried her through decades of farm life, though the weight of recent years showed in the gentle lines around her eyes. "There's my sunshine girl," Eleanor called out, her voice warm as fresh biscuits. Grace tumbled from the back seat, 8 years old and all elbows and knees, her dark hair already escaping from the careful braids her mother had woven that morning at the airport. The farmhouse had been in the family for 4 generations. Its white clapboard siding weathered to a soft gray that spoke of countless seasons. Morning glories climbed the porch columns with determined cheerfulness, their purple blooms the only splash of color against the fading paint. Behind the house, overgrown fields stretched toward a line of oak trees that marked the beginning of what the family simply called the backwoods. "Mom and Dad get off okay for their trip?" Eleanor asked, wrapping Grace in arms that smelled of lavender soap and fresh coffee. "Dad was worried about leaving me for so long," Grace said, her voice muffled against her grandmother's shoulder. "But Mom said I needed to spend real time with family, not just holiday visits." Eleanor's expression softened with understanding. Grace's parents, both university professors, had been planning this European research sabbatical for 3 years. 6 weeks seemed like an eternity to an 8-year-old, but Eleanor had volunteered immediately when they'd asked about summer arrangements. "Well, your Aunt Margaret and Uncle Robert are already here," Eleanor said, picking up Grace's small suitcase. "And Susan drove down from Richmond yesterday. It's been too long since we've had the whole family together." Through the screen door, Grace could hear the familiar sounds of adult conversation punctuated by the clink of coffee cups. Her Aunt Margaret's laugh carried from the kitchen, followed by Uncle Robert's deeper chuckle. These were the voices of her childhood summers, though this visit felt different somehow, more important, more permanent. The kitchen still held the same warm chaos Grace remembered. Aunt Margaret, her father's younger sister, stood at the stove turning bacon with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd raised 3 children. Her graying blonde hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and flour dusted her apron from an earlier batch of biscuits. Uncle Robert sat at the old oak table, his farmer's hands wrapped around a coffee mug as he studied what looked like legal documents. "There's our girl," Margaret said, turning to give Grace a hug that smelled of vanilla and bacon grease. "You've grown at least 3 inches since Christmas." Aunt Susan looked up from her own stack of papers, her designer glasses perched on her nose. As the only family member who'd moved to the city and made what she called real money in real estate, Susan always brought an air of gentle sophistication to these gatherings. But her smile for Grace was genuine and warm. "We were just discussing the farm," Susan said carefully, trying to figure out the best path forward. Grace noticed the way the adults' voices changed when they thought she wasn't paying attention. There had been hushed conversations for months about what to do about the farm and Mother's situation. Even at 8, Grace understood that keeping the farm running took more money than it made. "The property taxes alone are becoming impossible," Robert was saying, his voice heavy with frustration. "And the maintenance on this old house." He stopped when he noticed Grace listening. "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart," Margaret said quickly. "Adult stuff. Why don't you take your things upstairs and get settled?" Grace's bedroom was exactly as she'd left it the previous summer. The same faded quilt her great-grandmother had sewn, the same collection of horse figurines on the windowsill, the same view across the back fields toward the mysterious woods that had always captured her imagination. She unpacked slowly, listening. To the murmur of conversation from below from her window, she could see the remnants of what had once been a thriving farm. The barn still stood, though its red paint had faded to rust, and several boards had come loose in recent storms. The chicken co-op was empty now, its wire door hanging open like a mouth. Only Eleanor's vegetable garden showed signs of active care. Neat rows of tomatoes and beans that would feed the family through summer. It was while arranging her books on the small shelf that Grace first saw him. A flash of gold near the old fence line caught her eye. At first, she thought it might be the neighbor's retriever, but as she watched, a dog emerged from the tall grass by the property line. He was clearly a golden retriever, though his coat was matted and unkempt. Even from a distance, Grace could see he was thin, possibly lost or abandoned. The dog stood perfectly still, as if he was waiting for something or someone. "Grandma," Grace called, clattering down the stairs. "There's a dog outside. I think he might be lost." Eleanor joined her at the kitchen window, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "Well, I'll be. Haven't seen him before. He does look like he could use a good meal. Can we help him?" Grace asked, already moving toward the back door. "Careful, honey," Margaret warned. "Strange dogs can be unpredictable. He might be sick or frightened." But Grace was already stepping onto the back porch, her hand extended in the universal gesture of friendship. "Here, boy, it's okay." The dog's head turned toward her voice, and even across the distance, Grace felt a strange recognition. His ears perked forward, and he took several deliberate steps closer to the house. There was something in his bearing, his careful approach, that suggested intelligence and purpose, rather than the random wandering of a lost pet. "He knows me," Grace said, with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "I can tell." Robert joined them on the porch, his expression skeptical. "Grace, you've never seen that dog before in your life." "But he's been waiting for me," she insisted. "Look at how he's watching." Indeed, the dog had moved closer, stopping just beyond the garden gate. His golden eyes were fixed on Grace with an intensity that made the adults exchange glances. This wasn't the desperate attention-seeking of a hungry stray. This was something else entirely. "Maybe he belongs to the new people who bought the Morrison place," Susan suggested. "Though that's quite a distance for a dog to wander." Eleanor descended the porch steps slowly, her movements careful on the uneven ground. "Come here, boy. Let's have a look at you." The dog approached with surprising confidence, allowing Eleanor to examine him. His coat was indeed matted and dirty, but underneath the neglect, he appeared healthy. What struck her most was his behavior, calm, almost dignified, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. "No collar," she announced. "But he's been cared for recently. His teeth are clean, and he's not as thin as he first appeared." Grace had worked her way closer during Eleanor's examination. When she knelt and extended her hand, the dog moved directly to her, pressing his head against her small palm with a gentleness that spoke of careful training. "He chose you," Eleanor said quietly, something in her voice that made the other adults look at her sharply. "Mom, we can't just adopt every stray that wanders onto the property," Robert said practically. "We're trying to figure out how to manage what we already have." But Margaret was watching Grace and the dog with a thoughtful expression. "There's something different about this one. Look how calm he is. Most strays are either aggressive or cowering. This fellow acts like he belongs here." "Wow, he can't stay outside," Grace declared with 8-year-old authority. "He needs food and water and a place to sleep." The dog, as if understanding the conversation, looked up at Grace and then toward the old barn with what could only be described as purposeful interest. His behavior was so deliberately communicative that even skeptical Robert found himself following the dog's gaze. "It's almost like he's trying to tell us something," Margaret murmured. Susan, ever practical, sighed. "One more mouth to feed is the last thing this family needs right now." But Eleanor was studying the dog with the intensity she usually reserved for her account books. Something about his appearance had triggered a memory, though she couldn't quite grasp it. There was something familiar in his bearing, his coloring, even the shape of his head. "We'll figure it out," she said finally. "Grace, why don't you get him some water from the pump? And Margaret, I think there might be some leftover chicken in the refrigerator." As Grace hurried to fill a bowl with cool water, the dog positioned himself near the garden gate, perfectly placed to observe both the house and the distant tree line. His presence brought an unexpected sense of completeness to the morning, as if some missing piece of the farm's daily rhythm had suddenly been restored. "You know," Eleanor said quietly to Margaret as they watched Grace tend to their unexpected visitor, "my father used to tell stories about a dog just like this one. Said our family always had a golden retriever going back generations." "Really?" Margaret asked. "I don't remember any dogs when we were growing up." Eleanor's expression grew distant. "That's because the last one died when your father was just a boy. During the war years, we couldn't afford to keep pets." She paused, studying the dog with growing intensity. "But Dad always said the dogs came back when the family needed them most." The conversation was interrupted by Grace's excited voice. "He's not just drinking. Look, he keeps turning toward the woods, like he wants us to follow him." Indeed, the dog would drink for a few moments, then lift his head and stare meaningfully toward the overgrown fields and the dark line of trees beyond. His behavior was so deliberately communicative that even the skeptical adults found themselves following his gaze. "Probably just caught a scent," Robert said, but his tone lacked conviction. The dog finished drinking and moved to Grace's side, pressing against her legs with obvious affection. But his attention remained divided, constantly returning to the woods as if something there demanded his attention. "What do you see out there, boy?" Grace asked, scratching behind his ears. "What's so important?" The dog looked up at her with those remarkable golden eyes, and for a moment, the entire family stood in perfect silence. In that moment, even the most practical among them felt the stirring of something beyond ordinary explanation, the sense that this animal had arrived not by chance, but by design. As if to emphasize the point, the dog took several deliberate steps toward the tree line, then stopped and looked back at Grace expectantly. "He wants me to follow him," Grace said with absolute certainty. "Absolutely not," Robert and Margaret said simultaneously. But Eleanor stood quietly, her weathered hands clasped before her, studying the dog with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had been bothering her for years. "Maybe," she said so softly that the others had to strain to hear. "It's time we found out what he's trying to show us." That afternoon, while the adults debated practical matters over coffee and account books, Grace found herself alone with the golden retriever in the side yard. The dog had settled comfortably in the shade of the old apple tree, but his gaze never strayed far from the distant woods. There was a patient quality to his watching, as if he was waiting for the right moment to act. Grace knelt beside him, running her fingers through his tangled coat. As she worked to remove a particularly stubborn burr, her fingers encountered something unexpected, a thin leather strap partially hidden beneath the matted fur around his neck. "What's this, boy?" she whispered, carefully working the strap free. The leather was old and worn soft, clearly handmade rather than store-bought. Attached to it was a small brass object that made Grace's breath catch. It was a compass, but unlike any she'd seen in her father's camping gear. This one was antique, its brass surface green with age, and when she held it steady, the needle pointed not north, but directly toward the woods. "That's impossible," she murmured, turning the compass in different directions. No matter which way she faced, the needle swung decisively toward the tree line. The dog had been watching her discovery with what seemed like approval. When she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her heart race intelligence far beyond what she expected from any animal, and a kind of urgent patience, as if he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment. "You want me to follow this, don't you?" she asked. The dog stood immediately, his tail wagging once in what could only be interpreted as confirmation. Grace glanced toward the house. Through the kitchen window, she could see her family still gathered around the table. Eleanor's weathered photo album spread before them as she showed Susan and Margaret pictures from the farm's better days. Their voices carried faintly through the screen door, deep in discussion about property taxes and maintenance costs. The compass felt warm in her palm, its needle steady as a promise. The dog had moved to the garden gate and was looking back at her expectantly. Every instinct told Grace she should tell the adults about her discovery, but another part of her, the part that had always trusted in magic and possibility, whispered that some discoveries were meant to be made alone first, understood in the quiet of a child's heart before being subjected to adult practicality. Just a quick look, she told herself, slipping the compass into her pocket. The dog seemed to understand her decision. He waited until she reached the gate, then began walking with purposeful strides toward the overgrown fields. His path was direct and confident, as if he'd traveled this route many times before. The tall grass whispered around Grace's legs as they crossed the abandoned pasture. Wildflowers had claimed the space where cattle once grazed Queen Anne's, lace and black-eyed Susans creating a tapestry of white and gold. Butterflies rose in lazy clouds at their approach, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called. The dog never hesitated, never paused to investigate interesting scents or chase the rabbits that bounded away at their approach. His focus remained absolute, directed toward whatever lay waiting in the woods ahead. As they neared the tree line, Grace felt a peculiar sensation, as if the air itself was charged with anticipation. The compass in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, and the dog's excitement became more evident, not the random enthusiasm of a pet on a walk, but something deeper and more purposeful. The woods were older than anything Grace had experienced. These weren't the managed forests near her home in town, but ancient growth that had stood when her great-great-grandfather first claimed this land. Oak and maple trees rose like cathedral pillars, their canopy so thick that the afternoon light filtered down in scattered golden coins. The dog led her along what might once have been a path, though decades of neglect had allowed understory growth to reclaim much of the route. Grace had to push through tangles of wild rose and grapevine, their thorns catching at her clothes. But the dog moved through the obstacles as if they weren't there, his golden coat somehow slipping between barriers that snagged her at every step. They had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when Grace saw it. Through a gap in the trees, partially hidden by a curtain of wild grapevines, stood the unmistakable silhouette of a building. But this wasn't the simple farmhouse architecture she knew. Even shrouded in vegetation and softened by years of neglect, she could see the elegant lines of what had once been a mansion. "Oh my," Grace breathed, forgetting to whisper. The dog had stopped and was watching her reaction with what seemed like satisfaction. His tail wagged once, a gesture of quiet triumph. Grace pushed through the final barrier of vines and found herself in what had once been a formal garden. Broken fragments of stone paths wound between overgrown beds where roses had reverted to wild briars, and ornamental trees had grown into towering giants. A dry fountain stood at the center, its carved angels green with moss, but still graceful in their eternal dance. The mansion itself was 3 stories of weathered brick and stone, its windows dark and empty, but its bones still strong. Ivy covered much of the exterior walls, and several chimneys showed gaps where mortar had failed, but the structure remained fundamentally sound. Wide stone steps led to a front entrance that spoke of wealth and care from a bygone era. Grace pulled the compass from her pocket. Its needle pointed directly at the mansion's front door. "This is it," she whispered to the dog. "This is what you wanted to show me." But even as she spoke, she realized this couldn't be the end of their journey. The dog's posture suggested they had reached an important waypoint, but not their final destination. He was still alert, still focused on something beyond what she could see. The sound of distant voices calling her name made Grace's heart jump. Her family had discovered her absence. "Grace, Grace, where are you?" Robert's voice carried clearly through the afternoon air, followed by Margaret's higher call and the deeper tones of men she didn't recognize, probably neighbors who had been enlisted in the search. The dog's ears pricked forward, but he showed no sign of alarm. Instead, he moved to Grace's side and pressed against her legs in a gesture of comfort and solidarity. "I have to go back," Grace told him. "They're worried about me." The dog looked toward the mansion, then back at Grace as if weighing options. Finally, he gave a soft huff of understanding and began retracing their path through the woods. But he moved differently now, with less urgency and more deliberation. Several times he stopped and looked back at Grace, as if ensuring she was memorizing landmarks for future reference. His behavior suggested this was only the first of many visits to come. They emerged from the woods to find the entire family gathered in the backyard, along with 2 neighbors Grace recognized from previous summers. Eleanor stood on the porch steps, her hands shading her eyes as she scanned the fields. Margaret paced near the garden gate, her face tight with worry. Robert was just returning from checking the barn, and Susan stood with her cell phone pressed to her ear, clearly considering whether to call for official help. "Grace!" Margaret cried when she spotted them approaching through the tall grass. "Thank goodness. We were scared to death." The relief in her family's voices made Grace feel guilty for causing such worry, but it was mixed with excitement about her discovery. The dog patted calmly beside her, showing no sign of the exhaustion Grace felt after their woodland adventure. "Where on earth have you been?" Robert demanded, his relief manifesting his anger in the way of frightened adults. "We've been searching for over an hour." "I followed him," Grace said simply, indicating the dog. "He wanted to show me something." Eleanor came down from the porch, her eyes sharp as she studied both Grace and the dog. "And what did he show you?" Grace hesitated. The discovery felt too big, too important to blurt out in front of everyone, and something in the dog's steady gaze suggested he agreed. "Just the woods," she said finally. "But there's something special back there, something important." "Grace," Susan said, with the patience of someone trying to reason with an unreasonable child, "you cannot go wandering off into the woods with a strange dog. Anything could have happened to you." "But he's not strange," Grace protested. "He knows exactly where he's going. And he was protecting me the whole time." The adults exchanged the looks that Grace was learning to interpret as polite disbelief. But Eleanor continued to study the dog with an expression of growing thoughtfulness. "What kind of important?" Eleanor asked quietly. Grace's hand moved instinctively to her pocket, where the brass compass rested against her fingers. The dog sat beside her, his golden eyes moving between Grace and Eleanor, as if he was weighing how much truth this moment could bear. The kind that changes everything. Grace said with the absolute certainty that only children can possess Dot in the silence that followed. The dog lifted his head and looked directly toward the woods, his bearing so purposeful and dignified that even the skeptical adults found themselves following his gaze toward the mysterious tree line, where shadows were beginning to lengthen with the approach of evening. The evening dinner conversation revolved around Grace's afternoon adventure, though the adults seemed more focused on establishing rules about wandering off than understanding what she had discovered. Grace ate her grandmother's pot roast in relative silence, the brass compass a warm weight in her pocket and the dog's presence a comfortable pressure against her legs under the table. Eleanor had insisted the dog be allowed inside for the meal, a decision that had raised eyebrows but no serious objections. The golden retriever had positioned himself between Grace's chair and the kitchen window that faced the woods, as if maintaining a watch even during domestic activities. "The point is," Robert was saying, as he helped himself to seconds of mashed potatoes, "we need to establish some boundaries. Grace, you cannot simply disappear into the woods without telling anyone where you're going." "But I wasn't alone," Grace pointed out reasonably. "I had him." She indicated the dog, who had been following the conversation with unusual attention for an animal. "That's exactly the problem," Margaret interjected. "We don't know anything about this dog. Where he came from, whether he's been vaccinated, if he belongs to someone else." Susan nodded in agreement. "We should probably put up some posters in town. Check with the veterinarian's office. Someone must be looking for him." Grace felt a stab of panic at the thought of the dog being claimed by strangers. But what if nobody's looking for him? What if he's supposed to be here? Supposed to be here how? Robert asked with gentle skepticism. Grace glanced at Eleanor, who had been unusually quiet during the discussion. Her grandmother was studying the dog with the same thoughtful expression she'd worn all afternoon, as if trying to solve a puzzle that had been bothering her for years. "Grandma," Grace said carefully, "you said earlier that our family used to have golden retrievers. Do you remember what they looked like?" Eleanor's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Now that you mention it," she set down her utensil and really looked at the dog for the first time since they'd sat down. "The coloring is right, and the size. My father's dog was about this size, with that same intelligent expression." "What was his name?" Grace asked. "Compass," Eleanor said without hesitation, then stopped as if surprised by her own answer. "I haven't thought about that in decades. How strange that I should remember it so clearly." The dog's ears perked forward at the name, and his tail gave a single deliberate wag. Grace's hand moved to her pocket, where the brass compass seemed to pulse with significance. "Compass," she repeated softly, and the dog turned his full attention to her. "That's just coincidence," Susan said practically. "Lots of dogs respond to tone of voice, not specific words." But Eleanor was staring at the dog with growing intensity. "There's something else, something I should remember." She rose from her chair and moved to the old hutch where she kept family photographs and important papers. "I know I have some pictures from when your grandfather was young." She returned with a weathered photo album, its black pages held together with fading ribbon. Grace scooted her chair closer as Eleanor flipped through decades of family memories, faded sepia photographs of stern-faced ancestors, yellowing snapshots of holiday gatherings, formal portraits of people in clothing from another era. "Here," Eleanor said, stopping at a page near the middle. "This was taken in 1943. Just before your grandfather left for the war." The photograph showed a young man in military uniform standing in front of the very farmhouse where they now sat. Beside him was a golden retriever whose resemblance to their current visitor was unmistakable. The same intelligent eyes, the same noble bearing, even the same distinctive white markings on the chest and front paws. "It's him," Grace breathed. "It's exactly him." "It's the same breed," Robert corrected, but his voice lacked conviction. "Golden retrievers tend to look similar. Margaret leaned closer to examine the photograph. "The markings are remarkably similar," she admitted. "But dogs don't live 70 years, Grace." Eleanor continued turning pages, and 3 photographs later, Grace gasped. The image showed her great-grandfather as a young man, standing beside what was unmistakably the same barn that still stood behind their house. Next to him was another golden retriever, and this dog could have been an identical twin to the one now sitting at Grace's feet. "That's from 1923, Eleanor said quietly. "My grandfather and his dog, also named Compass." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. None of the adults seemed ready to voice. The dog sat perfectly still, his golden eyes moving from person to person as if gauging their readiness to accept what the photograph suggested. Grace pulled the brass compass from her pocket and placed it on the table. The antique metal gleamed in the lamplight, its needle pointing steadily toward the kitchen window that faced the woods. "I found this around his neck," she said simply. Eleanor reached for the compass with trembling fingers. As soon as she touched it, her expression changed completely. "This belonged to my grandfather," she whispered. "I remember him showing it to me when I was about Grace's age. He said it had been in our family for generations." "Mom," Robert said carefully, "that's impossible. You said yourself that Compass was lost decades ago." "I said we thought it was lost," Eleanor corrected. "Along with a lot of other things when we nearly lost the farm during the Depression." She turned the compass over in her weathered hands. "Look at the engraving on the back." Grace leaned closer to see the delicate script etched into the metal. "To guide the worthy home EM 1889. Ezra Morrison," Eleanor said softly. "My great-grandfather. He had this compass made when he first bought the land." She looked up at Grace with eyes bright with unshed tears. "Grace, do you understand what this means?" Before Grace could answer, the dog rose from his position and moved to the kitchen window. He stood on his hind legs, placing his front paws on the sill, and stared intently toward the dark line of trees. His posture was so deliberate, so purposeful, that everyone at the table turned to follow his gaze. "He's trying to tell us something," Grace said with absolute certainty. Eleanor stood and joined the dog at the window. In the gathering dusk, the woods looked mysterious and inviting, full of shadows and secrets. "My grandfather used to tell stories," she said quietly, "about things hidden in those woods. Important things that were meant to be found when the family needed them most." "What kind of things?" Margaret asked. Eleanor shook her head. "I was young when he died, and I thought they were just stories. Tales to entertain a little girl. But he always said the compass would lead the way when the time was right." The dog dropped back to all fours and returned to Grace's side. He sat and looked up at her with an expression that seemed to say, "Now you understand." Grace stood and moved to her grandmother's side. "He showed me something today. In the woods. Something big and important." She paused, gathering courage. "There's a mansion back there, hidden in the trees, and the compass points right to it." The revelation hung in the air like a challenge. Robert and Margaret exchanged skeptical glances, but Susan was studying the compass with the sharp attention of someone accustomed to evaluating property claims. "A mansion?" Susan asked carefully. "How big a mansion?" 3 stories, Grace said, with stone steps and carved angels in the garden. "It's old and covered with vines, but it's still there." Eleanor gripped the edge of the windowsill. "The Morrison estate," she whispered. "It really exists." "What Morrison estate?" Robert demanded. Eleanor turned to face her family, the compass still clutched in her hands. "According to family stories, Ezra Morrison built a grand house somewhere on this property. But it was abandoned when the family lost most of their land during hard times. Everyone assumed it was just a legend." The dog padded back to the window and gave a soft huff, as if calling attention to something in the darkness beyond. Grace joined him, pressing her face to the glass. In the faint starlight, she could just make out the dark line of the trees, but nothing more. "Tomorrow," Grace announced with 8-year-old determination, "we're going back, all of us. And he's going to show us everything." Sleep eluded Grace that night. She lay in her childhood bed, listening to the old house settle around her and the gentle breathing of the dog, who had claimed the braided rug beside her dresser. Through her window, the woods were a wall of darkness punctuated by the occasional firefly, but Grace's imagination populated the shadows with visions of the hidden mansion and its secrets. Twice she heard footsteps in the hallway, her grandmother, moving restlessly through the house, and later, the murmur of adult voices from the kitchen below. The discovery of the compass and the revelation about the Morrison estate had clearly disturbed more than just Grace's sleep dot when morning finally arrived. It brought with it the kind of perfect summer day that seemed designed for adventure. The dog was already awake, sitting by the window with the patient alertness of a sentry. As soon as Grace stirred, he moved to her bedside, his tail wagging with quiet enthusiasm. "Good morning, Compass," she whispered, testing the name. The dog's immediate response, ears forward, eyes bright, confirmed what she'd already known. Whatever mystery surrounded his arrival, this was definitely his name. Downstairs, she found Eleanor in the kitchen, surrounded by photographs, documents, and several old books that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. Her grandmother had clearly been awake for hours, lost in research that had scattered papers across every available surface. "Find anything interesting?" Grace asked, helping herself to a glass of orange juice. Eleanor looked up with eyes that sparkled with excitement and something that might have been vindication. "More than I expected," she said, holding up a leather-bound journal. "This was my grandfather's diary. I'd forgotten I even had it." Grace moved closer, Compass padding silently beside her. The journal was filled with careful handwriting and faded ink, documenting the daily life of a farmer in the early 1900s. But Eleanor had marked several pages with slips of paper. "Listen to this," Eleanor said, reading from an entry dated September 15th, 1923. "Compass led me to the old foundation today. Still can't believe Father actually built that house. All these years, I thought it was just family legend. But there it stands, grand as anything, just waiting for someone to remember it exists." Grace felt a shiver of excitement. "So it's real. The mansion is really there. According to this, your great-great-grandfather built it as a summer retreat for the family. But when the farm started struggling financially, they moved back to the main house and let the mansion fall into disrepair." Eleanor turned several pages. "But here's the interesting part. Listen to this entry from October 3rd. Decided to hide the important papers in the mansion. If times get worse, at least the family legacy will be preserved. Compass knows the way." The dogs always know the way. The kitchen door opened, admitting Robert and Margaret, both looking like they'd had as little sleep as Grace. Robert carried a thermos of coffee, and Margaret bore a basket that smelled of fresh muffins. "Any earth-shattering revelations this morning?" Robert asked with the gentle sarcasm of someone who wasn't quite ready to believe in family legends. Eleanor showed them the journal entries. Margaret read over her shoulder, her expression growing more serious with each line. "Important papers," Margaret repeated. "What kind of important papers?" "Property deeds, most likely," Eleanor said. "Maybe stock certificates or bank records. During the Depression, a lot of families lost everything because they couldn't prove ownership of assets." Susan arrived just as Eleanor finished speaking, her real estate agent's instincts clearly activated by talk of property documents. She brought her laptop and a collection of official-looking folders. "I spent some time last night researching property records," she announced, setting up her computer on the cleared end of the kitchen table. "And I found some very interesting information." The family gathered around as Susan opened a series of documents on her screen. According to county records, this farm originally comprised nearly 300 acres. But over the years, parcels were sold off to pay taxes and debts. What's left now is about 40 acres. We know that, Robert said. That's why we're having trouble keeping up with expenses. But here's what you don't know, Susan continued. Those sold parcels? Several of the sales were questionable. Forced sales during the Depression, often for much less than market value. And in at least 3 cases, the sales may have been fraudulent. Eleanor's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. What does that mean? It means, Susan said carefully, that if we could prove the original family owned more land than what's currently deeded to this property, we might be able to reclaim some of those lost acres, especially if we could find the original property deeds and prove fraudulent transfer. The weight of this revelation settled over the kitchen like morning fog. Compass had been listening to the conversation with the unusual attention he seemed to give all family discussions, but now he stood and moved to the back door, looking meaningfully at Grace. He wants to go back, Grace said, to the mansion. I think he knows where those papers are. Margaret looked skeptical. Grace, honey, you can't assume a dog understands legal documents. But Eleanor was studying the photograph she'd found the night before, the image of her grandfather with his golden retriever. My grandfather always said the dogs were special, that they understood things beyond what normal animals could comprehend. We're talking about property worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, Robert said slowly. Maybe millions, depending on what's been developed on the sold parcels. Susan nodded grimly. The Morrison subdivision that was built on the old North pasture? That's 32 houses on what used to be family land. If we could prove fraudulent transfer. She was interrupted by Compass, who had moved to Grace's side and was gently but insistently nudging her toward the door. His behavior was unmistakable. He wanted to leave, and he wanted to leave now. I think we need to go to the mansion, Grace said. All of us. Today. Eleanor closed the journal and stood with decision. The child is right. We've spent enough time wondering and speculating. It's time to see what's actually there. Robert and Margaret exchanged glances. As the practical members of the family, they'd been the most resistant to the growing sense of mystery surrounding the dog and the hidden mansion. But Susan's research had given their situation a concrete urgency that was impossible to ignore. We'll need flashlights, Margaret said finally, and probably some tools if we're going to do any serious exploring. And cameras, Susan added with professional instinct. If we find anything significant, we'll need documentation. An hour later, the family set out across the overgrown fields toward the woods. Eleanor moved slowly but determinedly, using a walking stick Robert had cut from an old hickory branch. Margaret carried a backpack filled with supplies, while Susan documented their route with her phone's camera. Grace walked beside Compass, who had assumed the role of guide with obvious satisfaction that the dog's confidence was remarkable. He led them along what Grace now realized was a carefully chosen path, avoiding the worst of the undergrowth while maintaining a direct route toward their destination. Several times, he paused to look back, ensuring the slower-moving adults were keeping pace. It's like he's done this before, Margaret observed, breathing hard from the exertion of pushing through tall grass and tangled vines. Maybe he has, Eleanor said quietly. Maybe they all have, for generations. As they neared the tree line, Grace felt the same electric anticipation she'd experienced the day before. But now it was magnified by the presence of her family and the weight of their shared expectations. The compass in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, and Compass's excitement became more evident in the spring of his step and the alertness of his bearing. The woods closed around them with cathedral solemnity. Ancient oaks and maples filtered the morning light into shifting patterns of gold and green, while birds called from the canopy above. The air smelled of rich earth and growing things, but underneath lay something else, the faint scent of old stone and weathered wood. When the mansion finally came into view through the screen of vines and undergrowth, even the skeptical adults fell silent. Grace had tried to describe it the night before, but words couldn't capture the sense of faded grandeur that clung to the old building like morning mist. My God, Susan breathed. It's enormous. The mansion was indeed impressive, even in its current state of picturesque decay. 3 stories of weathered brick rose from a foundation of fitted stone, with tall windows that spoke of high-ceilinged rooms within. Ornate chimneys punctuated the roofline, and despite the ivy that covered much of the exterior, the architectural details remained elegant and refined. Compass led them through the overgrown garden to the front steps, where carved stone lions guarded an entrance that had once welcomed guests to a very different world. The massive wooden door stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of shadowed interior spaces. Someone's been here recently, Robert observed, noting the relatively clear path to the entrance. These vines have been cut back, and the door's been opened. Eleanor moved closer to examine the entrance. Or maybe, she said softly, it's been waiting for us to return. Grace pulled the brass compass from her pocket. Its needle pointed directly at the open doorway, steady and sure as a promise. Compass sat beside her, his golden eyes fixed on the dark interior with an expression of patient expectation. Wow, Grace announced with 8-year-old determination. Let's go see what he wants to show us. The interior of the mansion exceeded even Grace's imagination. As her family stepped through the doorway, their flashlight beams revealed a grand foyer with a sweeping staircase that curved upward into shadows. Despite decades of abandonment, the bones of elegant architecture remained intact, crown molding thick with dust but unbroken. Hardwood floors scarred by time, but still solid. Underfoot. Compass moved through the space with the confidence of familiarity, leading them past a formal parlor where sheet-covered furniture created ghostly silhouettes in the filtered light. Wallpaper hung in tatters, and water stains marked the ceiling in several places, but the fundamental structure remained sound. This must have cost a fortune to build, Susan whispered, her voice echoing in the vast space. The craftsmanship. A lone look at those ceiling medallions, the millwork around the doors. Eleanor moved slowly through the foyer, her weathered hand trailing along the mahogany banister. I remember stories about my great-grandfather's pride in this house. He brought craftsmen from back east, used the finest materials available. Margaret was documenting everything with her camera, the flash creating stark moments of illumination that revealed both grandeur and decay. Grace, how did you find the specific room yesterday? This place is enormous. But Grace was following Compass, who had moved with purpose toward a doorway at the rear of the foyer. The dog paused at the threshold and looked back at her expectantly, his tail wagging once in invitation. He knows exactly where he's going, Grace said, moving to join him. The room they entered had clearly been a library. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls. The most of the books had long since succumbed to moisture and time. A massive stone fireplace dominated the 4th wall, its carved mantelpiece depicting hunting scenes that spoke of a more leisurely era. But it was the desk that captured everyone's attention. Positioned near the tall windows that faced the garden, it was a magnificent piece of carved walnut that had somehow survived the decades in relatively good condition. And sitting prominently in its center was a leather-bound journal, as if someone had been reading it just moments before. That wasn't there yesterday, Grace said, with absolute certainty. Eleanor approached the desk with trembling hands. The journal was old but well-preserved, its leather binding supple despite its age. When she opened it, the pages revealed same careful handwriting they'd seen in her grandfather's diary. But these entries were older, more formal. Property survey and family records. Eleanor read from the title page. Compiled by Ezra Morrison, 1889 to 1925. Robert moved closer, his practical nature warring with growing excitement. What does it say? Eleanor turned pages carefully, scanning entries that detailed property purchases, improvements to the land, and family births and deaths. But it was a section marked Legal Documents and Holdings that made her catch her breath. Listen to this, she said, her voice strengthening with excitement. All original property deeds, stock certificates, and legal papers are secured in the family vault. Location known to Compass and marked by the true North Stone. Compass had positioned himself beside a specific section of the fireplace, his nose touching a stone that was slightly different from the others, darker granite among the local limestone. The true North Stone, Grace said, understanding immediately. Susan was already examining the fireplace with professional interest. This stone is definitely different from the rest. And look, there are tool marks around the edges, as if it's been removed before. Robert pulled a multi-tool from his pocket and began carefully working around the edges of the stone. It took several minutes of patient effort, but eventually the stone shifted, revealing a cavity behind it. There's something in here, he announced. Reaching into the space, what he withdrew made the entire family step closer. It was a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, its surface green with age but still intact. An ornate lock secured the lid. Engraved on the top were the same initials they'd seen on the compass. E.M. Eleanor's hand shook as she examined the box. There should be a key, she murmured. Grandfather always said the compass and the key worked together. Grace pulled the brass compass from her pocket and studied it more carefully. What she'd initially taken for decorative engraving around the edge proved to be something more. Functional, a small section that could be rotated, revealing a cavity inside the compass itself. There, she said triumphantly, shaking a small brass key from the compass's interior. It was here all along. The key fit the lock perfectly. When Eleanor turned it, the mechanism opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the silent library inside the box. Wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from moisture and time were documents that made Susan gasp with professional recognition. Original property deeds, she breathed, handling the papers with reverent care. And these are, oh my God, these are stock certificates. Railroad stock, mining claims, even some early automotive investments. Eleanor spread the documents on the desk, her flashlight revealing page after page of careful legal writing in formal script. The Morrison holdings were much more extensive than anyone knew. Not just the farm, but investments throughout the region. Margaret leaned over her shoulder, studying a property deed that described boundaries extending far beyond their current farm. According to this, the original Morrison property included what's now the Morrison subdivision, the shopping center on Route 9, and the entire valley where the new industrial park was built. But how is that possible? Robert asked. All of that land was sold off decades ago. Susan was examining the documents with growing excitement. Not sold, stolen. Look at these dates. Most of these forced sales happened during the Depression, when families were desperate and legal oversight was minimal. If we can prove these sales were fraudulent, she was interrupted by a sound from deeper in the mansion, a soft thudding, as if something had fallen. Compass immediately alert, his ears pricked forward and his body tense with attention. What was that? Grace whispered. The dog moved to the library doorway and stood listening, his posture suggesting both caution and recognition. After a moment, he looked back at Grace and gave a soft huff. Not alarm, but communication. He wants us to investigate, Grace said. Eleanor carefully rewrapped the documents and placed them back in the metal box. We should get these somewhere safe first, and maybe return with more equipment, more help. But even as she spoke, they could hear footsteps in the foyer, human footsteps, deliberate and purposeful. Someone else is here, Margaret whispered. instinctively moving closer to Grace. Compass's behavior changed dramatically. His hackles rose slightly, and he positioned himself between the family and the doorway. But his stance wasn't aggressive. It was protective, watchful. "Hello?" A voice called from the foyer. "Is someone in here?" The voice was elderly, male, and carried the accent of someone who'd lived in the area for generations. Eleanor exchanged glances with her family, then called back, "We're in the library. Who's asking?" Footsteps approached, and an elderly man appeared in the doorway. He was perhaps 80, with white hair and a beard that spoke of retirement from outdoor work. But his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and his bearing suggested someone accustomed to authority. "Name's Henry Walsh," he said, looking around the library with obvious familiarity. "I've been the caretaker for this place for near on 40 years. And unless I miss my guess, you folks would be the Morrison family." Compass approached the stranger with tail wagging, not the enthusiastic greeting he'd given Grace, but the respectful acknowledgement of an old friend. Eleanor stepped forward with dignity. "I'm Eleanor Morrison. This is my family. And you are?" "The man your great-grandfather hired to watch over this place until the rightful family came home," Henry said simply. "Been waiting a long time for this day. Though I admit, I expected Compass here to lead you back eventually." Grace stared at the old man. "You know about Compass?" Henry's weathered face crinkled into a smile. "Child, I've been feeding that dog's ancestors for decades, and training them when necessary. The Morrison family always had a golden retriever, always named Compass. And they always knew the way home when the time was right." The revelation hung in the air like morning mist, transforming everything they thought they understood about their discovery. "You've been waiting for us," Eleanor said slowly. "All this time." "Yes, ma'am," Henry replied. "And now that you're here, we've got a lot of work to do." Henry Walsh led them through the mansion with the confidence of someone who had walked these halls for decades. As they moved from room to room, he shared stories that brought the abandoned house to life with memories of its better days. "Your great-grandfather was a remarkable man," Henry told Eleanor as they climbed the grand staircase to the second floor. "Ezra Morrison didn't just build this house. He built an empire. Railroad investments, mining claims, even early patents for agricultural equipment. But he was smart enough to know that wealth could disappear as quickly as it came." Grace walked beside Compass, who seemed to know exactly where Henry was leading them. The dog's demeanor had changed since the old caretaker's arrival, less urgent, more confident, as if a burden he'd carried alone was now shared. "So he hid everything," Margaret said, her voice echoing in the tall ceilinged hallway. "Not hid," Henry corrected. "Preserved. There's a difference. He knew hard times were coming, could see the signs even before the first market crashes. So he made sure the family's real wealth would survive, no matter what happened to the visible assets." They paused outside a door that looked identical to the others lining the hallway, but Henry produced an old brass key from his pocket and unlocked it with practiced ease. "This was his private study," Henry said, pushing the door open. "The real heart of the Morrison Empire." The room beyond was a revelation. Unlike the other spaces they'd seen, this study had been carefully maintained. Dust covers protected the furniture, and the windows had been sealed to prevent moisture damage. When Henry pulled away the covers, they revealed a magnificent library and office that looked as if Ezra Morrison had just stepped out for lunch. The walls were lined with ledgers, legal documents, and correspondence dating back to the 1880s. A massive safe stood in one corner, its door slightly ajar. And covering most of one wall was a detailed map of the region, marked with colored pens and notations in the same careful handwriting they'd seen in the family journals. "Behold the Morrison holdings as they really were," Henry said with obvious pride. "Not just a farm you know about, but investments throughout 3 counties." Susan approached the map with the fascination of someone who understood property values. These markings, they show mining claims, timber rights, even early development projects. She paused, studying a section marked in red ink. Wait a minute. This area here, that's where the new highway interchange is being built. Henry nodded gravely. The state's been trying to buy that land for 5 years. Current owners are asking $12 million for the development rights. $12 million? Robert repeated faintly, which would belong to the Morrison family. Henry continued, if the proper ownership could be established. Eleanor was examining the ledgers with growing amazement. All of this, the investments, the property claims, it's all documented here. Every transaction, every contract, every legal document, Henry confirmed. Your great-grandfather was methodical about record keeping. But more than that, he was smart about protecting those records. Grace had been exploring the room with compass, who had led her to a particular section of the wall where a portrait hung, a formal painting of a distinguished man with intelligent eyes and a golden retriever at his side. That's him, Henry. Sod, noticing her attention. Ezra Morrison and the First Compass. Painted in 1895 when the house was completed. Grace studied the portrait with fascination. The man in the painting had the same determined expression she'd seen in old family photographs. But it was the dog that captured her attention. The resemblance to her compass was so exact that it seemed less like genetics and more like magic. How is that possible? She asked Henry. How can the dogs be so identical across generations? Henry's expression grew thoughtful. Your great-grandfather believed in what he called breeding for purpose. Not just physical characteristics, but intelligence, loyalty, and what he termed spiritual continuity. Each compass was trained by the previous one, taught the same roots, the same responsibilities. You're talking about dogs teaching other dogs, Margaret said skeptically. I'm talking about animals that understood their role in protecting the family legacy, Henry replied seriously. And before you dismiss it as impossible, remember that you're standing in a room that's been perfectly preserved for nearly a century. LED here by a dog that somehow knew exactly where to find you. The afternoon sun slanting through the sealed windows cast everything in golden light, making the preserved study seem less like a museum and more like a shrine to careful planning and patient hope. Eleanor stood before the safe, its open door revealing neat stacks of documents and several small wooden boxes. There's more, she said quietly. Henry nodded. The contents of that safe represent the true Morrison fortune. Not just property and investments, but collections that have appreciated beyond anything Ezra could have imagined. Susan was already examining the contents with professional interest. These appear to be stock certificates, original shares in companies that she stopped, her face pale. Eleanor, these are original shares in what became General Electric, Standard Oil, even early railroad companies that were eventually absorbed into major corporations. How much? Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Susan was calculating rapidly, her real estate background helping her estimate values. Conservatively? If these holdings are legitimate and can be properly authenticated, we're looking at somewhere between $50 and $200 million. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Compass's tail tapping against the wooden floor. The dog had positioned himself near Grace, watching the adults process the magnitude of their discovery with what seemed like satisfaction. $200 million, Eleanor repeated slowly. But there's a problem, Henry said, his expression growing serious. These holdings, these claims, they're only valuable if the Morrison family can prove legitimate ownership. And over the years, there have been challenges. Legal disputes, conflicting claims, fraudulent transfers. Margaret sank into one of the preserved chairs. What kind of challenges? Henry pulled a thick folder from one of the desk drawers. Starting in the 1930s, Various individuals and corporations began filing claims against Morrison Properties. Some were legitimate creditors from the Depression era, but others were more questionable people claiming they'd purchased land or mineral rights, often with documentation that couldn't be properly verified. "So even though we found all this," Robert said heavily, "we might not be able to claim it." "Not without a fight," Henry admitted. "But that's why Ezra was so careful about documentation. Every transaction, every contract, every legal detail is recorded in these ledgers. The question is whether modern courts will recognize 19th century legal procedures." Grace had been listening to the adult conversation with growing concern. The excitement of discovery was being tempered by the reality of legal complications, and she could sense her family's growing worry about whether their newfound fortune would remain beyond their reach. Compass seemed to sense her mood. He moved to her side and pressed against her legs in comfort, then looked toward a section of the study they hadn't yet explored, a bookshelf that appeared to have been recently disturbed. "What's over there?" Grace asked Henry. The old caretaker followed her gaze and smiled. "Ah, the final piece of the puzzle. The one thing that will make all the legal challenges irrelevant." He led them to the bookshelf and pulled aside several volumes to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside was a single document in a protective case, its official seals and ribbons indicating its importance. "Ezra Morrison's last will and testament," Henry announced. "Filed with the state courts in 1925, but never probated because the family disappeared during the Depression. This document not only confirms the Morrison holdings, but establishes a family trust that supersedes all subsequent claims." Eleanor took the document with trembling hands. "A trust?" "A legal entity designed to survive exactly the kind of challenges the family has faced," Henry explained. "And according to the terms of this will, the trust becomes active when the rightful heir returns to claim it, guided by the family compass and accompanied by the guardian dog." Grace looked down at Compass, who was watching the proceedings with obvious contentment. "He brought us here to activate the trust." "He brought you here to reclaim your inheritance," Henry said simply, "just as his ancestors were trained to do for nearly a century." As the implications settled over them, Grace realized that their adventure was far from over. Finding the fortune was only the beginning. Now they had to figure out how to claim it, protect it, and decide what to do with wealth beyond anything they'd ever imagined. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, and Grace could hear the distant rumble of thunder. But inside the preserved study, surrounded by evidence of careful planning and patient hope, she felt only excitement for whatever challenges lay ahead. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke as the family prepared to leave the mansion. Rain drummed against the sealed windows while thunder rolled across the valley, but inside Ezra Morrison's preserved study, Henry Walsh was sharing revelations that would change everything the family thought they understood about their situation. "Before you take those documents anywhere," Henry said, his weathered hands folding the will back into its protective case, "there's something else you need to know. Something about Compass here, and why his arrival wasn't the coincidence you thought it was." Grace looked down at the golden retriever, who had been unusually quiet during the afternoon's discoveries. As if sensing her attention, Compass moved closer and pressed against her legs with what felt like comfort or perhaps preparation for difficult news. "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, though her voice suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Henry gestured toward the portrait of Ezra Morrison and his dog. "Your great-grandfather didn't just breed Compass's lineage for intelligence and loyalty. He bred them for longevity, much greater longevity than normal dogs possess." Margaret frowned. "That's not possible. Dogs don't live more than 15 or 20 years, no matter what breeding programs. The first Compass lived to be 43. Henry interrupted quietly. "The second lived to 38. This Compass," he paused, studying the dog with Obvious affection. This compass is 67 years old. The silence that followed was profound. Grace felt the world shift slightly, as if the laws of nature had just rearranged themselves around her. She looked into Compass's golden eyes and saw something she'd somehow missed before, a depth of experience that spoke of decades rather than years. "That's impossible," Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. Henry moved to another section of the study and withdrew a leather journal distinct from the others they'd seen. Ezra Morrison was many things: businessman, investor, visionary. But he was also what people in his time called a natural philosopher. He studied genetics, animal behavior, even what we might now call parapsychology. He opened the journal to a page filled with detailed notes and diagrams. He believed that intelligence and purpose could be enhanced through careful breeding, proper nutrition, and what he termed spiritual focus. The compass line wasn't just bred for physical traits. They were bred to serve as guardians of the family legacy. Eleanor reached out to touch Compass's head with new reverence. "You're saying this dog has been alive since 1958, Henry confirmed. "He was trained by his predecessor, just as that dog was trained by the one before. An unbroken chain of knowledge and purpose stretching back to the original compass." Grace knelt beside the dog, studying his face with new understanding. "You remember things. You remember when the family lived here." Compass looked at her with eyes that suddenly seemed ancient, wise beyond any normal animal's comprehension. His tail wagged once not the enthusiastic greeting of a pet, but the measured acknowledgement of someone who had waited decades for this moment of recognition. "But why now?" Susan asked. "If he's been alive all this time, why come forward now?" Henry's expression grew solemn. "Because time is running out. Not just for Compass, but for the family's legal claim to the Morrison holdings." He showed them another document from the study's collection, a legal notice dated 6 months earlier. "The state has filed proceedings to claim abandoned properties through eminent domain. Without a legitimate heir coming forward to assert ownership, the Morrison Trust will be dissolved and the assets transferred to state control." "When?" Eleanor asked urgently. "The final hearing is scheduled for next month," Henry said. "After that, it won't matter what documents we have or what claims the family can make. The property will belong to the state, and the investments will be liquidated to fund government projects." Margaret was studying the eminent domain notice with growing alarm. "Can they do that? Just take property that belongs to a family? When that family has been absent for nearly a century, and no heir has stepped forward to claim the inheritance?" "Yes," Susan said grimly. "It's called escheat law. Property without a clear owner reverts to the state." Grace felt a stab of panic. They found the treasure, discovered their heritage, only to learn it might be taken away before they could claim it. She looked at Compass, whose patient expression seemed to suggest he'd anticipated this complication. "You knew," she said to the dog. "You knew we were running out of time." Henry nodded. Compass has been increasingly restless over the past year. I think he sensed the approaching deadline. And when your family planned this summer visit, well, it was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. "But we don't even live here anymore," Robert protested. "Grace's parents are traveling, and the rest of us have our own homes, our own lives. How can we suddenly claim to be the rightful heirs to all this?" Eleanor stood with sudden determination, her back straight despite her 78 years. "Because we are the rightful heirs. This land, this house, these investments, they belong to our family. They always have." "But Eleanor," Margaret said gently, "the legal complications alone could take years to resolve. And the cost of fighting." "The state in court won't be necessary," Henry interrupted. "That's the beauty of Ezra Morrison's planning. The trust document specifies that activation requires only 3 things: the presence of a legitimate heir, the family compass, and the guardian dog. All other legal challenges become irrelevant once the trust is properly activated." Susan was examining the will with her professional eye. This is remarkably sophisticated legal work for the 1920s. It's almost as if he anticipated every possible challenge to the family's ownership. He did, Henry said simply. Ezra Morrison spent the last decade of his life preparing for exactly this situation. He knew that wealth could be lost, properties could be stolen, even families could be scattered. But he believed that blood, purpose, and careful planning would eventually bring the right people back to claim what belonged to them. Thunder crashed overhead, and the lights flickered in the study. But the storm outside seemed less important than the storm of implications swirling around Grace and her family. "So what happens now?" Grace asked. Henry smiled for the first time since beginning his revelations. "Now we file the proper paperwork to activate the Morrison Family Trust. We present the original documentation to the courts, and we establish you, Eleanor, as the trustee empowered to manage the family holdings." "Me?" Eleanor looked stunned. "I'm nearly 80 years old. I can barely manage the farm as it is." "But you're the eldest direct descendant," Henry explained. "And according to the trust documents, the trustee can appoint successors and advisors. You don't have to manage everything alone." Grace felt a surge of excitement as the implications became clear. "We can save the farm. We can fix the house, keep the land in the family. You can do much more than that," Henry said. "The Morrison holdings, properly managed, could support your family for generations. Education funds for children, business, investments, charitable foundations, whatever purposes the family trustees decide upon." Eleanor moved to the window, where rain was streaming down the glass in silver rivulets. "It seems too good to be true. Too easy." "It's not easy," Henry warned. "There will be legal challenges, media attention, probably attempts by various parties to contest the trust's validity. And there's the question of what to do with wealth of this magnitude. It brings responsibilities as well as opportunities." Compass had been listening to the conversation with the alert attention he brought to all family discussions. Now he moved to Grace's side and looked up at her with an expression that seemed to combine satisfaction with expectation. "He did his job," Grace said softly. "He brought us home." "Part of his job," Henry corrected. The Morrison guardians were bred not just to lead the family back to their inheritance, but to help protect and preserve it for future generations. As if understanding the conversation, Compass padded to the portrait of Ezra Morrison and sat beneath it, his golden coat echoing the painting's warm tones. In that moment, Grace could see the continuous line of guardianship stretching back through decades, loyal, patient, and endlessly devoted to the family they'd been created to serve. "Tomorrow," Eleanor said with decision, "we start the legal process. Tonight, we go home and begin planning for a very different future than any of us imagined this morning." As they prepared to leave the mansion, Compass took one last tour of the study, as if ensuring everything was properly secured for their return. When he rejoined Grace at the door, his bearing had changed, subtly less urgent, more settled, as if a great responsibility had been successfully transferred. The storm was beginning to clear as they made their way back through the woods toward the farmhouse. And though the path was muddy and the light was fading, Grace felt as if they were walking toward a dawn rather than a sunset. The following morning brought a flurry of activity that transformed the quiet farmhouse into the headquarters of a complex legal operation. Eleanor had called the family attorney first thing, rousing poor Mr. Hendricks from his morning coffee with news that left him speechless for several minutes. Grace found the adults scattered throughout the house, each absorbed in different aspects of preparing their claim. Susan had commandeered the dining room table, her laptop surrounded by printed documents, property maps, and several thick legal reference books she'd driven to town to purchase. Margaret was in the kitchen, making phone calls to various offices while feeding a steady stream of coffee and sandwiches to the others. Robert had taken on the task of photographing and cataloging every document they'd found, creating detailed records that could be presented to the courts. His farmer's methodical nature served him well in organizing the century-old papers that would support their claim. Eleanor sat in her favorite chair by the front window, the original Morrison family compass in her lap, reading through journals and correspondence that painted a picture of Ezra Morrison as a man of remarkable foresight and determination. Compass lay at her feet, his attention divided between the family's bustling activity and the windows that faced toward the hidden mansion. "The attorney will be here this afternoon," Margaret announced, hanging up the phone, along with a specialist in estate law and someone from the state archives to authenticate the documents. Grace felt a flutter of nervousness. What if they don't believe us? What if they think we're making everything up? Henry Walsh, who had arrived early with additional documents from the mansion's archives, looked up from his conversation with Robert. "Child, the evidence is overwhelming. The question isn't whether the courts will believe your claim. It's whether they'll be able to process it quickly enough to meet the legal deadlines." Susan pushed back from her laptop with a concerned expression. "That's what worries me. The eminent domain proceedings are scheduled for next month. Even if our claim is legitimate, the legal system moves slowly. We might win the case but lose the property simply because of timing." Eleanor closed the journal she'd been reading and looked around at her family with an expression of quiet determination. "Then we'll have to move quickly." "What exactly do we need to do?" Mr. Hendricks arrived that afternoon with 2 colleagues and an expression of barely contained excitement. Grace had never seen the elderly attorney display anything more emotional than mild interest, but the discovery of the Morrison Trust had clearly energized him beyond his usual professional reserve. "In 40 years of practice," he announced as he spread his own documents across the cleared dining room table, "I've never seen anything quite like this. The legal work is extraordinarily sophisticated enough to hold up in modern courts, comprehensive enough to address virtually every possible challenge." The State Archives specialist, a precise woman named Dr. Carolyn Webb, was examining the original documents with obvious fascination. "The paper, the ink, the handwriting, everything checks out as authentic period pieces. But more than that, these documents show up in state records. The Morrison Trust was officially filed in 1925, exactly as claimed. So, our ownership is legitimate?" Robert asked. "More than legitimate," the estate law specialist, Mr. James Porter, replied. "It's legally bulletproof. The trust was designed to survive exactly the kind of challenges that typically arise with long-dormant estates." Ezra Morrison clearly understood legal procedure better than most attorneys of his era. Grace had been listening to the adult conversation while sitting beside Compass, who seemed unusually restless. The dog kept moving to different windows, as if watching for something, and his behavior was beginning to make her nervous. "Is something wrong?" she asked him quietly, as if in response to her question. The sound of car engines in the driveway made everyone look toward the front windows. 3 vehicles were pulling up to the house, a black sedan, a van with government plates, and a pickup truck Grace didn't recognize. "Are we expecting more people?" Eleanor asked. Mr. Hendricks frowned as he watched several men in suits emerge from the vehicles. "I didn't call anyone else. Dr. Webb, Mr. Porter, are these colleagues of yours?" Both specialists shook their heads, their expressions growing concerned as they watched the visitors approach the house. Henry Walsh's weathered face had gone pale. "We have a problem," he said quietly. "Word has gotten out about the discovery." The lead figure approaching the house was a man in an expensive suit, who moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting his way. Behind him were 2 other men who looked more like security personnel than legal representatives. Margaret answered the firm knock at the front door, her smile fading as she faced the unexpected visitors. "Good afternoon," the lead man said with professional courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. I'm Richard Blackwood, representing the Morrison Valley Development Corporation. I understand you've been making some interesting discoveries on this property. Eleanor rose from her chair with dignity, the family compass still clutched in her weathered hands. I'm Eleanor Morrison. This is my family's property, and any discoveries made here are our private business. Blackwood's smile was practiced and cold. Actually, Mrs. Morrison, that's precisely what we need to discuss. My clients have substantial investments in property that may be affected by your recent claims. We're here to ensure that everyone's interests are properly represented. Mr. Hendricks moved to Eleanor's side, his professional demeanor sharpening. Mr. Blackwood, any legal challenges to my client's inheritance claim should be filed through proper channels. This kind of informal visit is highly irregular. Oh, we're not here to challenge anything, Blackwood replied smoothly. We're here to make an offer. My clients are prepared to purchase any claims the Morrison family might have to local properties. Cash offer, immediate settlement, no legal complications. Susan stepped forward, her real estate background helping her recognize the situation. What kind of offer? $5 million, Blackwood said without hesitation. For all claims, all documents, and agreement to cease any legal proceedings related to historical Morrison properties. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Grace could see her family weighing the offer. $5 million was more money than any of them had ever imagined having, and it would solve all their immediate financial problems without the uncertainty of legal battles. But Compass had moved to Grace's side, pressing against her legs with unusual intensity. When she looked into his golden eyes, she saw something that might have been urgency, even warning. What happens if we refuse your offer? Eleanor asked quietly. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but something in his tone became less friendly. Well, legal proceedings can be expensive and time-consuming, and sometimes complications arise. Property disputes, title challenges, questions about document authenticity. These things can tie up estates in courts for years, even decades. The threat was politely veiled but unmistakable. Grace felt Compass tense beside her, and she realized the dog's restlessness hadn't been random. He'd been sensing the approach of danger. Dr. Webb and Mr. Porter exchanged glances, their professional ethics clearly at odds with the pressure being applied to their new clients. Mr. Blackwood, Dr. Webb said carefully, the documents we've examined today are unquestionably authentic. Any challenges to their validity would be frivolous and quickly dismissed by competent courts. Of course, Blackwood agreed, but frivolous challenges can still be expensive to defend against, and my clients have considerable resources to pursue their interests. Eleanor straightened her shoulders with the dignity that had carried her through decades of farm, life, and family responsibility. Mr. Blackwood, my family's heritage is not for sale. Whatever legal challenges arise, we'll face them with the truth on our side. Blackwood's practiced smile finally faded. I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Morrison. I hope you won't regret that decision. As he turned to leave, Henry Walsh spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. Blackwood, he called out, his voice carrying decades of authority. Tell your clients that the Morrison Guardian is back on duty. They'll understand what that means. The developer paused at the door, his expression showing the first crack in his professional composure. Mr. Walsh, I should have known you'd be involved in this. I've been involved for 60 years, Henry replied steadily, and I'll be involved for as long as it takes to see the Morrison family's rights protected. After the unwelcome visitors left, the farmhouse felt smaller, as if the walls had closed in around them. Grace could see the worry in her family's faces. The offer had been tempting, but the implied threats had made the stakes terrifyingly clear. Who are these people? Margaret asked. And how did they find out about our discovery so quickly? Henry's expression was grim. Richard Blackwood represents some very powerful interests, developers, corporations, even some government officials who've profited from the assumption that Morrison properties were abandoned. Our claim threatens millions of dollars in questionable transactions.
So they'll fight us? Robert said heavily.
They'll do more than fight, Henry warned. They'll try to discredit the documents, challenge our legal standing, maybe even question the family's sanity. Rich people don't like giving up money they consider theirs, even when it was never legally theirs to begin with. Eleanor looked around. At her family, her children and grandchild, who had stumbled into a situation far more complex than any of them had anticipated. Are we doing the right thing? Maybe we should consider their offer. Grace knelt beside Compass, whose steady presence had been her anchor throughout the growing chaos. What do you think? She asked him quietly. Is it worth fighting for? The dog looked up at her with those ancient, wise eyes, and his answer was unmistakable. His tail wagged once not excitement, but determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. We fight, Grace announced with 8-year-old certainty. This is our family's legacy, and we're not giving it up without a battle. The next few days passed in a blur of legal preparation and mounting tension. Mr. Hendricks had assembled a team of specialists, while word of the Morrison discovery spread through the community like wildfire. Local newspapers picked up the story, and soon reporters were calling the farmhouse at all hours, seeking interviews with the family who had uncovered a hidden fortune. Grace found refuge from the chaos by spending time with Compass in the old barn, where the dog seemed most at peace. But even there, she could sense his growing restlessness. Several times she caught him staring toward the woods with an intensity that suggested he was waiting for something or watching for someone. The hearing is set for tomorrow morning, Eleanor announced at dinner on Thursday evening. Judge Morrison, no relation. Despite the name, will review our documentation and determine whether the trust can be activated before the eminent domain proceedings. Margaret pushed food around her plate without eating. Any word on what the other side is planning? Henry Walsh, who had become a permanent fixture at the farmhouse, shook his head grimly. Blackwood's people have been busy. They're challenging the authenticity of our documents, questioning the validity of the original trust, even suggesting that the family abandoned any claim to the property through decades of absence.
But we never abandoned anything, Robert protested.
We just didn't know it existed. Try explaining that to a judge who's under pressure from wealthy developers, Henry replied. These people have connections at every level of government. They're not going to give up without using every advantage they have. Grace noticed that Compass had stopped eating and was sitting alert beside her chair. His ears pricked forward as if listening to sounds beyond human hearing. What is it, boy? Before anyone could answer, the sound of vehicles in the driveway made them all freeze. But this time, instead of the expensive cars they'd come to associate with unwelcome visitors, Grace could see Henry's pickup truck and another vehicle she didn't recognize. Henry stood with obvious relief. That'll be my nephew Jake and his friend, from the State Attorney General's office. They've been researching Blackwood's clients, and what they found is very interesting. The two men who entered the kitchen carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people accustomed to serious legal work. Jake Walsh was clearly related to Henry, the same weathered features and intelligent eyes, though he wore a suit instead of work clothes. His companion was younger, with the intense focus of someone pursuing a complex investigation. Uncle Henry, Jake said, embracing the older man. Mrs. Morrison, family, this is Assistant Attorney General David Chen. Dave, meet the people I told you about. Chen shook hands with each family member, his manner respectful but businesslike. I understand you've uncovered some remarkable historical documents. My office has been very interested in your discovery. Why would the Attorney General care about our family inheritance? Susan asked carefully. Chun's expression grew serious. because the Morrison Valley Development Corporation and their associates may have been involved in fraudulent property transfers for decades. Your discovery could be the key to a much larger investigation. He spread several documents on the kitchen table. We've been tracking questionable land deals throughout this region for the past 5 years. Property sold under suspicious circumstances. Mineral rights transferred without proper documentation. Even some cases where legitimate owners were pressured into selling far below market value. Eleanor leaned forward to study the documents. You're saying this has happened to other families? Many other families, Chun confirmed. And in several cases, the properties involved originally belonged to the Morrison estate. Your great-grandfather's holdings were broken up and sold off during the Depression, but not all of those sales were legitimate. Grace felt Compass tense beside her as the implications became clear. So they stole our land and sold it to other people? That's exactly what we suspect, Jake said. And now that those properties are worth millions, the people who profited from the original theft don't want the real owners coming forward to reclaim them. Chun pulled out another document, a map showing property ownership throughout the county. If the Morrison Trust is activated and your family's original claims are recognized, it can invalidate dozens of property transfers and cost certain individuals hundreds of millions of dollars. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. They weren't just fighting for their own inheritance. They were threatening an entire network of corrupt land deals that had enriched powerful people for generations. That's why Blackwood was so eager to buy us off, Margaret said slowly. $5 million is nothing compared to what they stand to lose if we succeed. Henry nodded grimly. And it's why they won't stop at legal challenges. These people have too much to lose. To give up quietly. As if responding to the conversation, Compass suddenly stood and moved to the kitchen window that faced the woods. His posture was alert, almost warning, and when Grace joined him, she could see lights moving among the trees, flashlights or lanterns. Definitely human activity where no one should be. There's someone out there, she said quietly. Henry, and the other men immediately moved to the windows, their expressions growing tense as they confirmed Grace's observation. How many? Chun asked, his voice taking on the clipped tone of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. At least 3. Maybe more, Jake replied. And they're moving toward the mansion. Eleanor gripped the family compass tighter. What do they want? Chun's expression was grim. If I had to guess, they're looking for evidence to destroy before tomorrow's hearing. Documents, artifacts, anything that could support your claim. Grace felt a surge of panic. We have to stop them. That's our family's history out there. But even as she spoke, Compass was already moving toward the back door, his bearing transformed from domestic pet to guardian protector. After 67 years of patient waiting, the final test of his duty had arrived. The decision was made quickly. Chun called for backup, while Jake and Henry armed themselves with flashlights and the determination of men who had spent their lives protecting what mattered. Eleanor insisted on coming despite the family's protests, carrying the brass compass that had started their entire adventure. I've been waiting 80 years to see justice done for this family, she announced with quiet steel. I'm not staying behind now. Grace found herself swept along as the adults prepared for what felt like a final confrontation. Compass had positioned himself by the door, every line of his body radiating purpose and alert readiness. When Grace knelt beside him, she could feel the tension in his muscles, as if decades of patient waiting had suddenly focused into this single moment. You've been preparing for this, haven't you? She whispered. All those years you were getting ready to protect the family when it mattered most. The dog looked at her with those ancient wise eyes and gave a single, deliberate nod that seemed entirely human in its understanding. The walk through the dark fields toward the woods felt like moving through a dream. The adults spoke in hushed tones, coordinating their approach, while Grace stayed close to Compass, who moved with the silent confidence of someone following a familiar route. Above them, clouds covered the moon, making the night darker and more mysterious as they neared the tree line. The intruders' lights became more visible, at least 4 people moving through the mansion with systematic efficiency. Through the vulnerable, broken windows, Grace could see flashlight beams sweeping through rooms they'd explored just days before. "They're in the study," Henry whispered grimly, going through Ezra's documents. Chun motioned for quiet as his backup arrived to state. Investigators who moved with professional stealth. The plan was simple: surround the mansion and prevent the intruders from leaving with any evidence while documenting everything for legal proceedings. But Compass had other ideas. Before anyone could stop him, the golden retriever was moving toward the mansion with purposeful strides. His 67 years of breeding and training finally activated for their intended purpose. Grace started to follow, but Henry's hand on her shoulder held her back. "Let him go," the old caretaker said quietly. This is what he was made for. Through the mansion's broken windows, they could hear voices, men discussing which documents to take, which artifacts might be valuable. The casual conversation of people who believed they were safely hidden in the darkness. Then Compass entered the building. What followed was unlike anything Grace had ever witnessed. The dog didn't bark or attack. Instead, he seemed to become a force of nature, moving through the mansion with supernatural knowledge of every room, every passage, every hiding place. The intruders' confident voices quickly changed to confusion, then alarm as their lights began failing and their carefully planned operation dissolved into chaos. "What the hell?" one voice called out, followed by the crash of someone stumbling in the sudden darkness. "The lights keep going out," another voice complained. "And there's something moving in here." Grace watched in fascination as Compass appeared, briefly in a window, silhouetted against the moonlight like something from a legend. He moved between the intruders with ghostly efficiency, never directly confronting them but somehow disrupting everything they tried to accomplish. "He's hurting them," Eleanor observed with wonder. "Like sheep. He's driving them exactly where he wants them to go." Indeed, the confused voices were moving through the mansion in a specific pattern, guided by Compass's invisible presence toward what Grace realized was the front entrance, where Chun and his team were waiting. The first intruder emerged from the mansion at a run, stumbling over the overgrown garden paths in his haste to escape whatever had been pursuing him through the dark interior. He was immediately apprehended by the waiting investigators. The second and third followed quickly, equally desperate to leave the mansion behind. But it was the fourth figure that made Grace gasp in recognition. Richard Blackwood emerged from the mansion with furious dignity, carrying a briefcase and maintaining his composure despite the circumstances. But when Chun's flashlight illuminated his face, Grace could see the uncertainty beneath his professional mask. "Mr. Blackwood," Chun said with satisfaction, "what an interesting place to find you. I don't suppose you have an explanation for why you're trespassing on private property in the middle of the night?" "This property is subject to eminent domain proceedings," Blackwood replied stiffly. "My clients have every right to assess the condition of assets they may be acquiring, with a team of people removing historical documents." Chun gestured to the briefcase and the bags carried by Blackwood's associates. "That's not assessment, that's theft." As the investigators processed the intruders and secured the evidence they'd been attempting to steal, Compass emerged from the mansion and padded directly to Grace's side. His bearing had changed again, no longer the alert guardian, but a satisfied dog who had successfully completed a long and important task. Grace knelt and wrapped her arms around him, feeling the warmth of his golden coat and the steady rhythm of his breathing. "You did it," she whispered. "You protected our family's legacy." Eleanor joined them, her weathered hand reaching out to touch the dog who had served her family for longer than she'd been alive. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. For waiting, for watching, for bringing us home." In the distance, police sirens were approaching as local law enforcement arrived to support the state investigation. But Grace barely heard them. All her attention was focused on Compass, whose ancient eyes held a contentment she hadn't seen before, the piece of duty completed and purpose fulfilled. The battle for the Morrison inheritance was far from over, but the most crucial evidence had been protected. Tomorrow's hearing would proceed with all the original documents intact, and the attempt to suppress the family's claim had been not just thwarted but exposed as they walked back toward the farmhouse through the dark fields. Grace realized that Compass's greatest gift to her family hadn't been leading them to treasure. It had been teaching them to fight for what belonged to them, to trust in justice, and to never give up hope that right would eventually triumph. Overall, 6 months later, Grace stood in the restored garden of the Morrison mansion, watching her family gather for their first official reunion since the legal battles had ended. The victory had been decisive. Judge Morrison had not only activated the family trust, but had also launched a comprehensive investigation into fraudulent property transfers that ultimately recovered nearly $300 million in assets. For the Morrison estate, the mansion itself was undergoing careful restoration, with Eleanor serving as trustee and the entire family involved in decisions about preserving their ancestral home. Grace's parents had returned from Europe to find their daughter had not only discovered a fortune, but had helped expose a corruption network that had operated for decades. But for Grace, the real treasure walked beside her as she toured the grounds: Compass, whose health had remarkably improved since completing his life's mission. The veterinarians couldn't explain it, but Henry Walsh simply smiled and said that purpose had always been the best medicine for the Morrison guardians. "Hard to believe it's the same place," Margaret said, joining Grace near the restored fountain where carved angels once again danced in the spray of clear water. The overgrown garden had been transformed into a showcase of period landscaping, while the mansion itself gleamed with fresh paint and careful repairs. Eleanor emerged from the house carrying a thick photo album, a new one, documenting the restoration process and the family's growing understanding of their heritage. At 78, she moved with renewed energy, as if reclaiming her legacy had given her a second wind. "Grace, darling, would you help me with something?" Eleanor called. "I have a surprise to show everyone." The family gathered in the mansion's restored library, where the original documents were now displayed in climate-controlled cases alongside new family photographs. But Eleanor's surprise was something Grace hadn't expected: a small wooden box that had been hidden in the mansion's attic during the restoration. "The workers found this yesterday," Eleanor announced, opening the box to reveal a collection of letters tied with faded ribbon. Personal correspondence between Ezra Morrison and his wife, written during the mansion's construction. Grace listened as Eleanor read excerpts that brought the past to life, letters filled with love, hope, and dreams for future generations. But it was the final letter that made the entire family fall silent. "My dearest Margaret," Eleanor read, "I know that difficult times may come, that our family may be scattered, or our fortune lost to circumstances beyond our control. But I have faith that love endures beyond temporary setbacks, that family bonds survive even the longest separations. I have made provisions to ensure that our legacy will be preserved, not just in property and investments, but in the values we have tried to instill in our children. Someday, when the family needs it most, everything we have built will return to those who carry our name and our hopes. Until that day, I entrust our future to faith, to patience, and to the loyal guardians who will watch over what we cannot protect ourselves." Grace felt tears in her eyes as the words sank in. Ezra Morrison hadn't just hidden treasure, he had preserved hope itself, sustaining it through generations until the moment when his family needed it most. Compass, who had been resting by the fireplace, stood and padded to Grace's side. At her questioning look, He moved to the library window that faced the woods, then looked back at her with an expression that seemed to invite her to follow. "He wants to show me something," Grace told her family. They followed the golden retriever through the restored garden and into the woods, where a new path had been cleared during the restoration work. Grace was surprised when Compass led them to a small clearing she'd never seen before, where a simple stone monument had been erected. The inscription was brief but moving, in memory of the Morrison guardians, faithful companions who preserved hope through the darkest seasons and guided their family home when love called them back. "We had it made," Henry Walsh said, appearing from behind one of the ancient oak trees. "Seemed fitting to honor all the dogs who served your family over the years." Grace knelt beside the monument, where fresh wildflowers had been planted in a careful border. Compass sat beside her, his golden coat gleaming in the afternoon sunlight, and for a moment Grace could almost see the spirits of all his predecessors, generations of loyal guardians who had waited patiently for this day. "What happens now?" Grace asked Eleanor as they walked back toward the mansion. Her grandmother smiled with the contentment of someone who had seen justice done after a lifetime of waiting. "Now we build on what we've been given. The trust will fund education for family members, support local charities, and ensure that this land remains in Morrison hands for future generations." "And Compass?" Eleanor glanced at the dog, who was moving with the easy contentment of someone whose burden had been lifted. "Compass has earned the right to be a family pet for the rest of his days. No more guardian duties, no more watching and weighing, just love and comfort for as long as he wants them." As they reached the mansion, Grace noticed something that made her heart skip. Playing in the garden was a small golden retriever puppy, too young to be anything but recently arrived. "Where did he come from?" Grace asked. Henry Walsh's weathered face crinkled into a grin. "Showed up this morning, right at sunrise. No collar, no owner." But he walked straight to Compass like he was reporting for duty. Grace knelt to greet the puppy, who tumbled over her feet with enthusiastic affection. When she looked up, she saw Compass watching the interaction with obvious approval, his tail wagging with quiet satisfaction. "The cycle continues," Eleanor said softly. "The Morrison family will always have a guardian, and the guardians will always have a home." That evening, as the family gathered for dinner in the mansion's restored dining room, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them here. It had started with a simple act of kindness, offering help to a stray dog, and had led to discoveries beyond anything she could have imagined. But the real treasure hadn't been the money or the property, or even the vindication of family honor. The real treasure had been learning that love and loyalty could survive any separation, that patience and faith could preserve hope through the darkest times, and that sometimes the most unlikely guides could lead you exactly where you needed to be. As the sun set over the Morrison Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold that matched Compass's coat, Grace felt the deep satisfaction that comes from being exactly where you belong, surrounded by the people who matter most, with faithful companions at your side and bright possibilities. Stretching toward tomorrow, the Morrison family was finally home.